And now we're going to hear from reviewer Richard Pite with Al Ryan.
Now, Richard Pite is a drummer, multi-instrumentalist, jazz historian and founder of the Jazz Repertory Company. So who better to invite in tonight to review two new releases by two drummer-led bands, Donald Edwards' new release, Prelude to Real Life, and Herlin Riley, New Directions. So we'll start with Herlin Riley. You've picked two tracks, which are New Direction and Connection to Congo Square. We'll start with Connection to Congo Square. Why did you choose that one?
It had the most entertaining drum break I've probably heard in years, in which Herlin plays Reveille, the bugle call, on his drums and plays it brilliantly. Not an easy thing to do. He does it brilliantly, and I am a sucker for humour.
The interesting thing about the Congo Square thing is that it's based on this two-bar motif that kind of builds up. And I suppose the first thing that strikes you about his drumming is that he's very energetic. Talk to me a little bit about his drumming style.
It is interesting taking the two albums together because both of the drummers are from Louisiana, Herlin from New Orleans. Donald Edwards was raised outside of New Orleans, but he studied there in Baton Rouge. But they're very different approaches. Herlin Riley's approach is much more the New Orleans style approach. Donald Edwards says that he's very, very influenced by the kind of the musical atmosphere of New Orleans. But I think it's true to say that listening to his album, you wouldn't necessarily think, oh yeah, that's a drummer from New Orleans. I think you do hear that in Herlin's playing.
Yeah.
And the two very different approaches are that on Herlin's album, you get the feeling that the building block of his compositions is the feel that he wants to use. And what he'll do, he'll lay down a groove. And although there might be some interplay with the band, generally he's about the groove, and that is pretty consistent throughout. Donald Edwards, as we'll hear later, is much more of a conversational drummer. He's a busier drummer, and in a good way. He's an absolutely wonderful drummer. And one thing I should say, although I have criticisms about both albums, is they are both superlative drummers, and they have the kind of technique and musicality that I give my right arm for.
Okay, let's have a listen to Connections to Congo Square. That's Connections to Congo Square, Herlin Riley from his new album, New Direction. Now, the second track, Richard, is the first track on the Herlin Riley album called New Directions. Why'd you go for that one?
I like the rhythm, and I think if you're going to listen to a record by a drummer, it has to have a physical effect on you. What I liked about the Herlin Riley album is the grooves are great. It doesn't work throughout. I would say I was born and raised on vinyl.
Yes.
And so I'm used to the kind of 20-minute side. The problem now with CDs, of course, is that the albums are generally too long.
Yeah.
Both albums are over an hour. So essentially every album that's coming out is a double album in vinyl terms. That's an awful lot of material. I felt with the Hurlin album, it's divided in 20. The first 20 is exceptional material. The middle 20 is okay. And 20 minutes could have been ditched. And I reckon if the album was 40 minutes, which if it came out in vinyl 30 years ago, it would be a sensational album. But there's a little bit too much.
Okay, interesting observation. Now, some of the sidemen on this album, we've got Emmett Cohen on piano, Russell Hall on bass, Bruce Harris on trumpet, Godwin Lewis on alto sax and soprano sax, and Mark Whitfield on guitar. He only features on one track, which is the track we're going to listen to, New Directions. I think he makes a very good account of himself on that track. Let's have a listen to it. It's Jazz Now on BBC Radio 3. We're chatting to Richard Pite and he's reviewing two albums for us tonight, and the second of which, Donald Edwards, Prelude to Real Life.
I had problems with this album. As I said earlier, I can't fault his playing. I think it's astonishing. Not only is his playing wonderful, he is a marvellous drummer, but the playing of the ensemble is terrific as well. I can't fault them. In fact, on both of these albums, for me, the standout players are the pianists.
It's a young band as well.
Yeah. So what he's trying to do here is, as with his previous album, Evolution of an Influenced Mind, which I think is a much better album, by the way.
Yes.
What he's doing on that first album is he's talking about his influences in his early life, and he's making compositions based around his early experiences as a musician. And it's got a great deal more gusto, using the same language as he's using now, which is quite abrasive, quite angular, quite difficult. And in fact, funnily enough, I don't know if you felt this, but some of the melodic lines reminded me of Frank Zappa. And what he's done with this album is that he's addressing themes of love, family, and fatherhood. But to me, it seems to be just in one emotional zone the entire time. I've chosen the first track because actually it's not at all typical of the rest of the album. And the other thing that intrigued me about it is that there are 3 very short tracks early on. And it rather reminded me of my progressive rock buying days, where you would sometimes get these tiny little tracks with portentous titles like sort of Threnody for World Peace, parts 1, 2, 3, and 4. And they would be little inserts between that and the big tracks. And you'd look at the vinyl and you'd look at the separation.
groove,
you think, wow, this track's enormous and that one's tiny. He does the same thing. But the bizarre thing is, actually, these tiny little tracks, I think, are musically the most interesting things. And they're gone in a flash.
In a flash.
Which is a shame.
Okay, let's have a listen to Taking Shape. This is the first track on the album. That's Taking Shape, Donald Edwards, from his new album, Prelude to Real Life. And I think what we're probably deciding is that it's probably the difficult second album. Not as good as the first album, you think, Evolution of an Influenced Mind, which is kind of very Ellingtonian, actually, in a title in itself.
It is. I was much more impressed by that. There was much more conviction. In fact, what I should say about that track is that one of the reasons I chose it is it's the biggest example I've heard in a long, long time of leading the listener up the garden path, because it is so different to everything else that follows from there. When the second track comes on, which is a sort of a slightly rather dull swinging number, it's like you've put on another album.
Which brings us on to the fact that there's also 2 standards on this album as well. There's Stablemates by Benny Golson and Skippy by Thelonious Monk, which I've chosen,
interestingly enough, Stablemates. I think he has rearranged, and as a result, he's burst the balloon of the vitality of that number. If you listen to, say, a version of Freddie Hubbard playing a storm on it with Benny Golson, the composer of the piece, and it's got a tremendous vitality and excitement about it. This version doesn't, but I must say, Skippy, to me, is the standout track, the Thelonious Monk composition. Suddenly, the sun comes out in Skippy, because there's a playfulness about it, which is inherent in the composition itself. If you lose that, you might as well just pack up and become an encyclopedia salesman. But what they do with it is they're true to the nature of the playfulness of the piece. It has humor, it's beautifully played, and to me, it's just a complete contrast to what has gone before, and sadly what follows as well.
That's Skippy by Thelonious Monk, played by the Donald Edwards Band from his new album Prelude to Real Life, featuring Walter Smith III on tenor sax and David Gilmour on guitar. No, not that David Gilmour. My thanks to Richard Pite for coming in tonight and talking so eloquently about our two new releases here on Jazz Now.